I am still, after all these years, sometimes asked why I have, as the symbol of my house, a clear cowpat with a strong arm coming up from it. And why I wanted, being the host of the Olympic Games, to have that as its symbol. I was blocked, of course, because I had to allow for other cities. Well, let me tell you the story of the strong man and the cow turd. It was very many years ago. I am an old man now. I'm 90 next birthday. It's in May, in case you wanted to celebrate. And it was when I was under 20. It was that long ago. Then my father was ruling. Now my father, Augean, was a very harsh man. In his day, he had been perhaps a mighty hero. And that was why the great gods gave him the gift of cows whose number could never be lessened. 3,000 there were or more. Immortal. You could slit them and they would slit them, cut their throats. And the next day, the cow would be born again. Our cows these days are not quite so remarkable, but they are still the finest breed in all of Augean. We had to find a bull in the end, you see. But at least that's another story. A story always of lessening. But back in those days, the cows were immortal. But that created a huge problem. By themselves, they would have eaten all the grass in Greece. So we used to feed them grain, rich food. That would keep them produce a lot of milk for less field. And we would keep them then in stables and feed them in great troughs. It was hard, back-breaking labour. And of course my father didn't do it, but he expected me, his eldest son. I wasn't a favourite child, to do the task. So I did what I could. I worked with the servant men. I even milked the cows. But I, and all his other royal sons, there was a job we refused to do. We would not clean the stables. And nor could he actually get any slave to do it. They would say they would rather die than go in there and clean those stables. And over the years, my father was an old man when it happened, 50 or more. And he had those cows nearly 30 years. The stables had never, ever been clean. And the shit had piled and piled and piled. And what we had done, this had been my father's idea. We just simply built the stables out until they covered half the palace. Until he started to demolish the town behind the palace. And occasionally we would topple the piles of poo down on the next place we were going to build, but by and large the place stank. And the flies! Of course my father had to move palaces in the end. He went up the hill for fear of the horseflies, where the two rivers are. Well, when he heard his old friend, the tyrant of tyrants, had the strongest man in all Greece at his beck and call to be, as it were, a living yo-yo, my father, Augean, he put in for a labour. He bid high. He gave the king 3 cattle. And so one day we saw him, all confidence, striding towards my father, and he said, "I have been told by that man I must serve, that my next labour will be given to me by you. So what enemies do you wish me to destroy?" And my father, who was not a kind or a sensible man, laughed. "Enemies? Well, there are billions of them." And the hero said, "Good. The more the merrier." I want you to destroy the flies. All the flies in my stable. And to do that, of course, you'll have to clean my stables out. And the hero looked at him askance and said, "What? Don't worry," said my father. "I will make it a heroic task. You must do it in a day, or the labour is not done. 1 day to clean my stables out." Well, the hero looked at him, took a step back and said, "All right, I will do it in a day. If I cannot do it in a day, you can take my life. But if I can I will say I demand as payment 1 in 10 of your cattle." Well, my father laughed and said, "Well, you can't do it, but be my guest." Well, I followed the hero. He went into the stables. He looked at the literal mountains of poo. So high it was, with a loud bzzz of flies. He was already slapping his thighs as those great horseflies, the size of hornets, came flocking towards him. And I was shouted, "Be careful, sir!" He smiled. And then he left the stables, and I thought, well, it wasn't really fair. It wasn't fair to ask a hero to do so much. And my father chortled and said, "Well, I'll have his life." I won't have his life, though. I won't take it. I'll enslave him. Now, this had happened all around the sun-up. But by midday, I noticed there was something funny about the river. The cattle were let out of the stables once a day to go and drink at the river. And I drove them down there. But the river was dry. Or at least, if not dry, it was drying. It had been a wet season. I assumed that there would have been a lot of water, but there wasn't. Well, I gave the cattle what I could. And then I climbed up the slope, up to find out where the water had gone. And at the top of where once there had been a fall, I saw the strong man piling rocks. He was building a great dam. A great dam that drove the two rivers together. And a lake was forming. But as I watched, he went down to the bottom of the lake and started with a great club, I think it was, to break rocks. And break rocks. And break rocks. And the water came tumbling after him. No other man could have done that. No other man could have stood in the water flow and break and break and break and break again. The water came tumbling down. And somebody must have gathered my father, because I saw him on the rock on the other side from me, the other side of where the river was being made, and he shouted, "He's changing the course of the river!" Observant man, my father, I don't think. And as we watched, the great tumult broke into the stables and started to wash away the shit. It washed it all clean away. Such was the tumult, right down to the great sea. And this great sea turned black. It's full of seaweed to this day that came. Absolutely full of seaweed to this day, and still stinks. And I remember my father when I smell that smell. Well, by sundown, it was all done. The stables were clean. And the strong man, he came before my father and said, "I demand my cattle." And my father said, "No, no, no! You were meant to do it by yourself. How dare you cheat and use the rivers? I might as well give it to the river sprites." "I demand my cattle now, or else." Now, a more sensible man than my father would have realised the danger in the voice. But my father was a bit of an oaf, and he said, "No! I have my army here!" He called up then all his great bronze warriors. Now, his guard then was about 25. And they were, of course, fully armed. For as a coward, he kept them fully armed at all times. And he drew his sword. But the great hero laughed. And as he laughed, he drew his club. And before any of the guards could move, he had brought the club full down on my father's laughing face. Then the great hero, seeing that I had been at the back of the hall, called me out and said, "Come here!" And to the guards he said, "I give you your new king." And he took the crown from my father and wiped it clean from blood, and he put it on my head. How it happened? So long ago, it hurts to remember. But the great hero, he said 2 further things to me. First, he suggested that we kept the stables cleaned by water, which we have, and I gave him 1 in 5 of my cattle. I think I must have cursed the breed when I did that, for we had to bring in bulls the next year to multiply the herd again, and so all things lessen. But they are still the finest cattle in Archaea, if not immortal. Be that as it may. He also said that we should have games to celebrate my coming to the throne. And so we went to a ravine not very far from my palace. And he, using his club again, beat the ravine out to create a narrow valley with high walls. And around those walls he set chairs. And we had a game, such a game. I only allowed him to perform in running and wrestling. And although people would run and wrestle for the pleasure of doing it, they all knew they would lose. But we had other prizes he could not compete in. And so it began. Once every 4 years we have celebrated them, in remembrance of him, the Olympic Games. And I gave him rich reward, and he gave me my badge in return, the cow turd and the strong arm, and strode off, stalking back to the tyrant of tyrants, who no doubt never expected him to return, and made personal remarks. I have heard that the tyrant tried to pretend that this was not a labour. But the hero snorted and said, "I was always going to do 12. For whatever you said, I knew you were a cheat." And anyway, that's the story of how the games are linked to my badge, the cowpat and the strong arm. A badge I wear with pride, even to this day.